There is one consequence when it comes to climate change that we rarely talk about, and it's an important one because it definitely affects the ocean pretty much directly. It's called ocean acidification. And it's something that can be complex, but on today's episode, we're going to be going through what the problem is, what it's doing to our oceans, and how can we find solutions for it, or what solutions can we implement in them. So we're going to talk about that on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. This is a podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. I apologize if my voice is going in and out. My daughter was in a tournament today, a hockey tournament this weekend. She won the tournament. Her team won the tournament. And my voice is a little hoarse because of it. And I'm not sorry for it. It was a lot of fun. She had a great time. It was a great team. And it was a lot of fun to watch. Anyway, back to the show. I wanted to have a little chat because this is something that I haven't talked about in a while. And I've talked about this before on the podcast. But it's also something that's really important. And it's a serious problem that we don't talk about enough in the oceans. And it's a consequence of climate change. It's called ocean acidification. And ocean acidification is just one of those things we just don't hear talked about. You don't hear it talked about in the media. You hear oceans are warming, or the atmosphere is warming, certain places and not other places, of course. But we never really hear of ocean acidification, which is a serious consequence to climate change. And so I want to talk about it today for a couple of reasons. One, I want to remind you what the problem was. I want to find and discuss some of the solutions that have been proposed, more on a general term, and hopefully we can get more in detail in the future. And the other is my older daughter, is taking chemistry, and her chemistry teacher did ask me one time, hey, could you come in and talk about ocean acidification and some of the solutions that are being given or being proposed to combat ocean acidification. So I was like, okay, let's try and do that. So we're going to do that. We're going to talk about that because I haven't really looked it up, to be honest. But I want to kind of go over the basics. So what is ocean acidification? Essentially, it's a sustained fall in the average pH of seawater in the world's oceans. So essentially, over the last 7 decades, scientists have monitored a steep fall in the pH of oceans from 8.15 to 8.0. And you're probably like, Andrew, that doesn't sound like it's a lot. But the scale is logarithmic, meaning that a small numerical drop represents a massive swing in acidity. So for instance, according to this article that I found, I'll put the link in the show notes, a change in pH of just 0.0 or 0.1, so a change in pH of 0.1 means the hydrogen ion concentration have climbed more than 26%. So pH essentially measures the concentration of hydrogen ions that gives seawater its acidity. So the more hydrogen ions present in the seawater, the greater acidity of the oceans. Now, if you have ever taken care of a marine aquarium before, an ocean aquarium with salt water, you'll know that the best pH is around 8.3. That's what coral reefs like. So if you have corals and you want to put corals in this marine tank, you have to have the pH at 8.3. Anything lower will make it suffer. And the reason why it makes it suffer is because of the chemical equation of salt water and how much calcium is available. And so with the introduction of CO2, it skews or alters the chemical equation of what's happening in seawater. So essentially what happens is, as the CO2 emissions have risen, the world oceans have actually absorbed the excess. And when the ocean absorbs excess CO2, it becomes carbonic acid, which is H2CO3. Carbonic acid further dissociates to become bicarbonate ion, which is HCO3 minus 3, HCO minus 3, and a hydrogen ion, making it so the more hydrogen ions that are in the water, it makes it more acidic. But what doesn't happen is that there's less calcium ions available in seawater. So a normal equation, you would have more calcium ions left over, right? And so when you have more calcium ions left over, the structures, the animals that use calcium to build their shells, to build their skeletons, will be greater. So animals such as corals, animals such as mollusks, so oysters, mussels, clams, scallops, they all take up, or snails, they all take up or calcium to build their calcium shells. That's what it's essentially made of, right? It's abundance of calcium carbonate that build their shells. So once they have that calcium carbonate in there, which is what normally what the equation provides, then you're looking at something that's great. It's calcium carbonate. But when there's too many hydrogen ions in there, when there's too much CO2, there's too many hydrogen ions. So the calcium doesn't bind to anything. It's just freely available. So it's not calcium bicarbonate anymore. So increased hydrogen ions reduces the vital carbonate ion levels, especially in colder and higher latitude waters that can absorb greater concentrations of CO2. So you can see it's just that negative feedback loop. As there's more CO2 being absorbed, it changes the pH. The pH means that a lower pH, which means more acidic waters, leaves more hydrogen ions in the water, which reduces the vital carbonate ion levels, especially in colder waters, right? And that's where we just at higher latitudes. So now we're looking, okay, so how does this affect, the ocean? How does it affect organisms? So as I mentioned before, the reduced calcification of corals, exoskeletons, and shells due to decreased carbonate levels in seawater. That's the one thing. There's a few I'm going to go through. Increased predation of mollusks, corals, and other organisms with exoskeletons because of their shells are weaker, right? The shells are weaker, so there are certain animals that can either crush or penetrate those shells. So the uptake of another consequence, the uptake of carbonic acid by fish leads to metabolic acidosis, a condition where the acid builds up in the blood and affects the metabolism. The acid acts as a stressor and comprises the growth and the reproductive functions of the fish. And then depression of marine organisms, biological systems, and function leads to depressed metabolism, reduced reproduction, and increased susceptibility to disease. Disruption of the process by which larval corals and other organisms migrate to an optimal marine environment to grow. Another one, larval urchins may have been found to struggle, or have been found, larval urchins have been found to struggle to digest their food in acidic conditions. Another one, phytoplankton and other marine microorganisms may struggle to reproduce if ocean pH becomes too deranged. And the last one, the growth of seaweed and marine vegetation may also change, altering the composition of many coastal ecosystems. So there are 8 consequences to ocean acidification that are pretty vital, pretty major consequences. So let's talk about the collapse of fisheries. So the fisheries that are sustained by normal ocean biochemistry are also under threat. Though larger organisms may be able to tolerate the acidification for longer, the loss of smaller organisms creates food stress that will lead to the dwindling of fish stocks. So essentially, the way the food web is built, when you start to lose plankton, when you start to lose mollusks, when you start to lose corals, you start to lose those vital habitats. So all those little species, all those little animals that were living in there and hiding in there, where they were food for other animals, or they cleaned animals. We see that in corals all the time. There's cleaning stations and so forth. All that goes away slowly, and then so you start to see the bigger fish start to suffer over the long term. They may not happen right away, but it'll happen eventually. So don't want to depress you on this fine Monday morning or afternoon or whenever you're listening to this during the week. So I want to talk some about the solution. So a lot of the solution really comes down to reducing the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. That's the biggest thing, right? So anything that we can do to reduce the introduction of new CO2 drastically as well as take out CO2 would be extremely important. So to do that, there are sort of two ways of doing it. There's direct methods of reducing ocean acidification, and there are indirect ways. So some of the direct ways we have here, they're like five. Like we're going to talk about 5 key ocean-based carbon dioxide removal methods. So the first one is cultivating seaweed for carbon sequestration. So seaweeds are seaweeds. They're a marine macroalgae that thrive on CO2. They're a plant, so they take in CO2 through photosynthesis. So it removes it from the water, converting it to the sugars that drive their growth. So cultivation of seaweed could sequester vast amounts of carbon dioxide, and depending on the seaweed species used, provide a delicious and extremely nutritious food source that does not require fertilizers to grow. Macroalgae can grow pretty much anywhere as long as it has this suitability for it. So the notable advantage of this ocean acidification solution is the rapid growth rate of many seaweed species, which can see some kelp varieties grow more than 2 feet in a single day, meaning that carbon removal could be accelerated by using the right species. So quick growing species of seaweed is great. Kelp, even better. 2 feet a day, let's go, right? But restoration can be very expensive. So protecting areas that have kelp, protecting areas that have macroalgae, protecting areas that have seagrasses, these are areas that will become vital when we start looking at protecting marine protected areas or installing marine protected areas for climate change. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago when I talked about it on the episode, talking about marine protected areas for climate and not just marine protected areas for protecting species, right? We're going to need areas that are less affected by climate change and that can combat climate change, such as protecting macroalgae, seaweed, kelp, seagrass, salt marshes, all these different areas that have plants that grow quickly with the right species. And there's some problems inherited in that, but we'll talk about that another time. That's one of the solutions. The second one is use phytoplankton cultivation for carbon sequestration. So phytoplankton is a microalgae at the bottom of the marine food chain. These microscopic organisms may be tiny, but they use CO2 again for rapid growth, taking it out of the atmosphere and water. Scientists believe that even a small rise of the overall mass of phytoplankton could impact CO2 levels and provide marine life with an abundant food source. Now, there have been experiments in the ocean that have been run, not necessarily a good thing, that try to fertilize the ocean by putting iron in the ocean to make phytoplankton bloom faster and more plentiful. This could be very problematic. And the reason why it can be problematic is because once you get the bloom, the phytoplankton eventually have to die and they have to go to the bottom of the ocean. And I've talked a number of times about the Mississippi River phytoplankton bloom in the spring, goes in the summer, the phytoplankton die, less wind, so there's less mixing, it drops to the bottom. Bacterial microbes will go through the microbial loop. They will break down the phytoplankton, the dead phytoplankton, use oxygen in the process, and deplete a lot of the bottom of the ocean from oxygen, where it becomes very difficult to house animal life at the bottom of the ocean. We've seen a large stretch of the Gulf of Mexico have hypoxic areas within the bottom 1.5 meters of the ocean in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's obviously problematic. So although there are experiments and there's research to harness phytoplankton for carbon dioxide fixation, it can be very problematic, and we have to be careful with that one. But the third one, enhancement of ocean alkalinity. This method primarily seeks to mitigate the effects of ocean acidification by introducing alkaline minerals that can help water pH move towards neutral. So less acidic and more towards neutral. Okay. The method accelerates natural rock weathering or adds alkaline material to the seawater. It is hoped that this will alter oceanic biochemistry that generates chemical reactions that overall lead to the movement of CO2 to deeper levels of the ocean. So I don't know exactly how all that part works, but I'll definitely look into it over the next little bit, because I think it's something that's really important. And then supporting the growth of blue carbon systems is the fourth one. More and more people are realizing that carbon dioxide emissions can be mitigated by simply putting carbon back where it belongs. A great example is the blue carbon ecosystem. So essentially what that includes in say tropical areas, you're looking at mangroves with salt marshes, right? Seagrass beds and kelp. So having a system, an ecosystem that has these different areas will absorb carbon dioxide at a faster rate than trees on land. And it'll put new carbon and old carbon into the soil. And then some of the carbon will go down to the deep sea just naturally, and others will go into the ground. Having these areas, these salt marshes, estuaries, mangroves, seagrass meadows, these are the areas that we need to protect and revitalize where possible, and if money is possible. And I feel like a lot of the climate taxes, a lot of the climate money that are generated to protect climate should go into these methods. All right, the fifth one, the direct ocean capture. So this isn't like this industrialized and energy intensive solution would see pumped seawater being stripped of its CO2 using electrochemistry in a dedicated facility comparable to that of a desalination plant. The CO2 removed would then be stored in deeper rock layers. Alternatively, the CO2 would be used to blast alkaline rocks to boost ocean alkalinity, enabling seas to absorb the atmospheric CO2. Again, that is still experimental, not always working the best from my understanding. I'll look into it more. I want to just provide this overview for you. Now, here's some indirect methods that could help. So building insulation. So the three biggest of most industrialized countries, the 80% of the carbon dioxide emissions are generated by three big things: energy generation, transportation, and buildings. Okay, so if you put building insulation and make sure that most of the buildings have building insulation, you can reduce the amount of heat that is required to heat those buildings or cool those buildings, the energy required to cool those buildings. So having that, that insulation reduces the heat loss. So putting more insulation in buildings will help reduce that heat loss. And so you'll use less energy to heat the buildings. Energy efficient lighting and appliances. So electricity generation accounts for at least 31% of the U.S. energy sector carbon emissions. So anything you can do to reduce your electricity consumption will positively affect carbon dioxide emissions. There are so many ways that you can reduce electricity, and there's a list of that in the article that I'll link to in the show notes. All you have to do is go on your app, just look for the show notes, and I'll show you, and it'll say link to the article, and it'll put it in there. Renewable energy is a third thing that will indirectly help reduce CO2 and energy consumption. So renewable energy can be, it can harness wind, water, sun, the geothermal energy to generate electricity by burning fossil fuels or wood. So what you're doing is you are not you're not using fossil fuels, right? You want to use renewable sources, wind, water, sun, and geothermal energy to generate electricity, right? So although we're looking at a time where we haven't met the world's energy demands yet, we're making a significant contribution in this area, and we know renewable energy drastically reduces the CO2 emissions in many countries around the world. So having EVs, having heat pumps, right, that will help reduce your CO2 emissions personally will really help. So next time you're looking to replace your furnace or your air conditioner or both, you would look at a heat pump to either heat or cool your home. And you can look for more information on that episode that I did along with Yana from Clean Energy Canada just a couple of weeks ago. I'll link to that in the show notes as well, so you can listen to that episode. And the fourth one is leave your car at home. So in other words, try not to use your car too much. If you have an EV, you can use your EV, but any gas-powered or fossil fuel consumption car or vehicle would be bad. Plus, walking, cycling, or using public transport is better for you anyway. It's better for not only for the atmosphere, but also for your health, especially the walking and cycling. Really, really easy. And then, of course, reducing your food miles. So eating local and locally grown foods will help in making sure that you do not have to worry about the transportation of food. So most meals in the U.S. will have traveled more than 1,500 miles to get to your plate. So transportation by food by road, rail, or air takes energy and releases CO2, with air freight being the most polluting. So by reducing that length, going to your local farmer's market, going to your local groceries, and making sure you're buying local as possible, you can just switch and eat seasonal food and really get into the food that's in and around your area. Number 6, repair, reuse, recycle. We've talked about this before. If you have items that can be repaired, then instead of throwing them out, I feel like we buy a lot of stuff now where if it can't be repaired, or sometimes items are too expensive to repair compared to buying a new one, or we often rationalize that. I'm the same way. I find that we can start repairing more things and using those repairs, say like iPhones or your mobile phones. I feel like that would be a lot easier and better. But the more you do that, the less you use in CO2 by making new products, by manufacturing, all that kind of stuff. We know recycling can be a bit of a scam. There are certain things that are more recyclable than others. Refusing single-use plastics is really big. Refusing a lot of items just because they're not recyclable, if you can, that would be great too. Reusing them is also great if you already have items that are really hard to dispose of. Those are always good. So doing that. There are protecting natural environments. So protecting natural environments, such as environments that will sequester carbon dioxide faster, is a lot easier to do than to restore habitats that have been lost. There have been a lot of habitats that have been lost. It's quite significant. And it costs a lot of money to restore a habitat. It does. Even like some fish habitat, I remember working for the government. It would cost $100,000, $200,000 to put a bunch of rocks in the water. Just to put rocks in the water to make fish habitat. It wasn't complicated, but it was expensive. But to protect fish habitat, natural fish habitat, was a lot cheaper. And to protect natural oceanic habitats that are really good at sequestering CO2, like seagrass beds and mangroves and kelp forests and salt marshes, those are the natural areas that we really need to protect and make sure that they are not harmed and not destroyed, so that we can continue to use them to absorb CO2, maybe even expand them, if I would dare say it. And then the last one is turn down your thermostats. In other words, use less energy at home. But like I said, if you can, as you are renewing your furnace, if you have to get a new furnace if you own a home, or get a new air conditioning if you own a home, then you can do that by looking for alternative sources, or alternative functions such as heat pumps. I know in Canada we're trying to do that more and more, putting programs together where they're replacing oil-based heating with heat pumps, which is going to drastically reduce the amount of CO2 that's emitted from homes that are heated from oil. So that'll be really great. That's it. That's all. Those are the tips that I have. That's the basic overview of ocean acidification. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to be talking a little bit more in depth about some of those solutions. Some of them are really we're far in I guess, like for protection and MPAs, we've gone pretty far and we're getting further. Others like carbon capture, it's still a bit of an experiment and in the research phase. It's very difficult to really predict, what's sinking carbon, or what sinking carbon sources are, like kelp and macroalgae and things like that will do to the deep sea. We're still learning about that. And so it's a very difficult process to do, but I'll keep you updated on where we're at, see if we can get guests that can talk about carbon sequestration and where we can go from there. And is there hope in that? And what should we be focusing on? So that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode on ocean acidification. This was a lot of fun for me to look at, but I think it's something that could be really cool in terms of learning more about ocean acidification and the projects that are being used for solutions. I think would be really cool. But that's it for today's episode. And I will link to this article that I took most of this stuff from, greencoast.org, and you can check that out in the link in the show notes. But I want to thank you so much. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact me through Instagram. DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. All one word, at How to Protect the Ocean. And I would love to hear from you. I am putting together a newsletter. I'm not sure if it's going to be weekly or daily, but I'm putting together a newsletter, and I'm going to try and share more news on a daily or weekly basis. Probably daily, I'm looking at, or semi-weekly, maybe, like maybe once or twice a week, where we're going to get more articles and be able to pump out more articles so that it keeps you informed. So keep listening to this, subscribe and follow this podcast to be able to listen to this so you can find out more information about that to get it right to your inbox. And I'm also trying to figure out how to create broadcast channels on Instagram as well as Facebook. I've started a chat in the Speak Up for Blue Facebook community, but I'd prefer to do, well, I like the chat because I can interact with people. But anyway, we're trying to figure that out, and hopefully that can be done quite soon. And those are the things that are upcoming. Something to look forward to. Anyway, thank you so much. I would love to hear from you at How to Protect the Ocean on Instagram. I really appreciate you listening. You have been listening to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.